Welcome to the Thrall's Redemption, Viking historical fiction, written by Bjorn Wolfe, narrated by R.K. Marks. Copyright 2023 by Audiobook.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit Audiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. Where wolves thrive better than lambs. In the 10th century, the Northmen, consisting of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, gained notoriety for their raiding and colonizing efforts throughout the world. From Iceland to Greenland, the fearless warriors made their mark on history. Even Greece and Africa were not safe from their pillaging. Descendants of the Viking Rollo ruled as Dukes of Normandy, and Saxon England was quickly falling under northern rule due to the failing leadership of Ethelred the Unready and unending harassment by Danish pirates. This led to the addition of a petition to the French litany, "From the fury of the Northmen, deliver us, good Lord." Trondhjem, a Norwegian city on Trondhjem Fjord and surrounded by the river Nid, was then known as King Olaf Tryggvason's new city of Nidaros. While it was not much more than a trading station and hamlet without streets, it was thriving with prosperity and celebration. The shores were lined with ships adorned with gilded dragon heads, purple and yellow hulls, and azure and scarlet sails. The riverbank and hillsides were abloom with colourful tents belonging to chieftains from all over the north who had come to visit the powerful Norwegian king. Traders had set up booths offering an array of goods, making it seem like a fair. The roads between the estates clustered around the royal residence were bustling with clanking horsemen, traders with covered carts of precious merchandise, and beautiful fair-haired women riding on gilded chair-like saddles. Monks, slaves, white-bearded lawmen, pompous landowners, and more added to the crowded spectacle. On one of the roads that crossed the city from the west, a Danish warrior rode on a sunny May morning with a young English captive bound to his saddle-bow. The Northman was a great, hulking figure, with unkempt hair and rough features, wearing an iron helmet and a mantle of coarse grey. A battle-axe handle could be seen protruding from the folds of his cloak. However, the young Saxon boy tied up next to him was strikingly handsome. Though only 17, he had a manly build, was lithe and well-proportioned, and carried himself with great dignity despite his clumsy garments of white wool. His proud grey eyes flashed defiance and revolt, undiminished by the chains and fetters on his limbs. As they journeyed north through the city, they happened upon a trading booth on the outskirts. The structure was a curious sight, a log cabin with radiant striped awnings fashioned over the top. Just beyond this, the terrain was composed of soft hills, overlooked by snow-kissed peaks draped in pine trees. On one side, a river flowed furiously, while the fjord sparkled brightly in the radiant sun on the other. At the sight of the trading booth, the Saxon's countenance transformed into a scowl, while the Dane exhaled a sigh of relief. The warrior dismounted his horse and removed his captive before the entrance. The trader beneath the vibrant shelter presided over an opulent spectacle. Pallid walls exhibited exquisitely crafted weapons and luminous fabrics, woven with strands of golden and silver thread. Ranges of luxurious furs piled up within corners, along with an amalgamation of gilded drinking horns, bronze pots and pans, and dignified silver urns. Across the back of the booth was an array of sullen-looking individuals such as slaves bound for war, native thralls, and 2 Scandinavian people sold into slavery, having fallen into debt. The wealthy merchant sat before them, wearing velvet and golden chains which were poised atop one of his massive steel chests like royalty. The Dane delivered an impolite nod to the trader, who responded using smooth words, as recommended by the thrifty old Norse proverbs. "Greetings, Håkon Arngrimsson. It seems there's great industry at hand if you've already acquired such a great piece of property via a Viking voyage this spring. How did you obtain him?" Håkon shoved his property ahead fiercely, and replied loudly from his thick neck like an angry cow. "I captured him in England last summer. The 20 of us stormed his father's castle, killing all his kinsmen. He hails from good blood, undoubtedly the son of a jarl. I assure you that he's vigorous and nimble. How much are you willing to pay me for him, Kelcrawl?" The booth's proprietor caressed his lengthy white beard and evaluated the captive closely. He had never encountered a king's son with such an arrogant demeanor. The boy wore his shackles like fashion accessories from Ethelred's hands. "Is he so valuable that you've kept him in chains?" the trader inquired. "In that I shall not deceive you," spoke the Dane, hesitating briefly. Though in wind and limb he is sound, in temperament he is not. Not long after I acquired him, I sold him to Gilly the Wealthy as a herd boy. However, due to his dissatisfaction with working on the dairy farm, he lost half of the herd and allowed wolves to prey on the remainder. When the headman wished to flog him for this, he killed him. He has the temperament of a black elf." "I agree. He does not appear to be a pleasant creature," responded the trader. "But why was he not executed for his actions? I have heard that Gilly is not an easy man." The Dane let out a snort. "More than anything, he is greedy and did not want to lose what he had paid. His wife Birgitta was once held captive by the English before marrying Gilly and advised him to keep the cub. I believe she has taken a liking to him. Gilly followed her suggestion as expected, and when I passed through their district yesterday, he gave the cub to me. I should have taken him to Thor myself," he continued with a sly swing of his axe, "but the silver is of use to me as well. I am in a hurry to join my shipmates in Wisby. Now, Chell Crawl, take him and give me what you consider to be fair." The trader took his time stroking his beard in thought, but eventually rose and asked for his scales. The Dane accepted the small pile of silver rings and departed from the tent, as well as from the English boy's life. It was a shame that the results of their brief interaction could not have disappeared with him. The trader examined his new acquisition, who stood tall and slender before him. "What is your name?" he asked. "Where are you from, and what is your lineage?" "My name is Aldric," responded the thrall. "I come from Northumbria." He paused, his face reddening. "But I will not disclose my father's name," he finished with pride. "You will not shame him by shaming me." The trader's patience began to wear thin. Even peaceful merchants were not without their martial side during those days. Without warning, he drew his sword from its sheath and pressed the sharp tip against the captive's chest. "Tell me without hesitation of your lineage. If you do not comply, this may be the last dialogue you have the pleasure of engaging in," he said sternly. Aldric's face fell white, but his lips curled with defiance, and so they remained there, locked in tense silence for what felt like an eternity. The point of the sword pressed through the fabric and pricked at the boy's flesh. Gradually the trader's visage softened into a sly grin. "You are a young wolf," he declared, ultimately withdrawing the blade into its scabbard. "Be seated amongst the others. The North requires more wolves than lambs, I wager." Chapter 2. The Maid in the Silver Helmet. Day in and day out, Aldric waited with bated breath to see where the next stroke of ill luck would land him. An endless stream of captivating characters visited his booth. There were the royal guardsmen, their massive frames armoured with glistening mail, who dined with King Olaf and fought valiantly by his side. A travelling minstrel, carrying his harp on his back, would often pause to exchange a song for a horn of mead. Once, even the Queen herself came to admire and purchase Aldric's exquisite spiral bracelets. She remarked on his snake-like eyes, but alas, did not take him with her. Through his booth's doorway, Aldric's view of the world outside evolved from day-to-day budding birch trees along the river, farmers tilling the valley, shepherds guiding their cotton-like flocks through the verdant hills. Occasionally groups of jovial revellers from the king's court would gallop by, their falcons at the ready for a hunt, their horns and spurs clanging. Other times, burly men claiming to be visiting chiefs swagged past, their boisterous laughter ringing out as they drank in nearby inns. Every so often their merrymaking would escalate into shouting and fighting, punctuated by the sound of clashing weapons and anguished moans. One day, while looking out with his chin resting on his hand, Aldric's attention was drawn to two swift riders making their way down a hill path. One wore a cloak of grey, the other a kirtle of brilliant scarlet. Disappearing behind a clump of aspen trees, they soon re-emerged, growing closer and closer. A white beard could be seen on the grey rider, while the scarlet-clad rider had hair as bright as gold, which flowed behind them in the wind. But what boy could have such hair, even if born into royalty? Aldric wondered if it could in fact be a girl, one of those famed shield maidens about whom he had heard so many songs. Fascinated, Aldric watched as the pair galloped closer, eventually coming right past his booth. And then, his mind raced as he rose with excitement. Something had spooked the white horse, causing it to swerve and nearly toss its rider from the saddle. Then, without hesitation, the horse charged forward with the girl still on its back. Her blonde hair flowed behind her, and Aldric couldn't help but notice how much she looked like a mythical centaur. Suddenly disaster struck. The horse stumbled, tossing the girl to the ground and dragging her along the rocky road. Aldric's determination to help overpowered his shackles as he rushed forward, but before he could reach her, One of the trader's servants had stopped the horse, and a crowd quickly surrounded the girl. Aldrich watched in horror as the group obscured his view, imagining the worst. The shrieks of his mother's waiting women echoed in his mind as the Danes pillaged their castle. And then, unexpectedly, the girl emerged from the crowd, covered in dirt and bruises, but with a calmness that defied belief. She examined her wrist with a smile on her face, seemingly unfazed by the accident. Ironbeard, the trader, arrived on the scene and was equally surprised at her resilience. "It's just a dislocated wrist, nothing to worry about," she assured him. "We can go inside and I'll fix it." Ironbeard looked at her with a mixture of adoration and amazement. "By the Stormwind, you truly are a shield maiden," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. The trader welcomed them with characteristic Norse hospitality. Aldrich watched in quiet amazement as the old man reset the broken bones without a complaint from the young woman. Despite her unusual outfit and unkempt appearance, Aldrich could see that she was a stunning girl, several years his junior. Her face was as delicate and pearly as a seashell, and her eyes were the deep blue of cornflowers blooming in a wheat field, accentuated by her flowing golden hair. Once the bone was set and bandaged, the trader gave them a silk scarf to use as a sling, and treated them both to hornfuls of sparkling mead. This piqued Aldrich's curiosity. There was an old Norse proverb, lie for lie, laughter for laughter, gift for gift. So while he accepted the trader's hospitality, Ironbeard began to seek a way to repay his kindness. Ironbeard's eyes scanned over bolts of fabric, piles of furs, and glistening armor before landing on the slave's bench. "Stormwind!" he exclaimed, putting his horn down. "It just now occurs to me that Tova, the cook's boy, might be in need of one now that Horde has drowned." The young woman caught his meaning and nodded in agreement. "It's unlikely that you'll find a better deal anywhere else." She turned to inspect the slaves, her gaze resting on Aldrich. She didn't blush or falter, but scrutinized him closely, like a piece of armor or a horse. It was Aldrich who became flush with sudden humiliation and fury, as he realized that in the eyes of this beautiful Norse woman he was nothing more than livestock for sale. "Yonder stands a fine thrall," she said coolly. "He looks like he could withstand a lot." "It's true," Ironbeard replied. "He is no crippled wolf who runs with the pack from Greenland. That was Horde's hindrance, and Einar Olafsson playfully held him under water until he drowned trying to escape. But this one, I think, would bite. What is the cost for this thrall?" The trader stated, "You must pay 3 silver marks for this English thrall, who possesses great strength and a well-built frame." The trader approached Aldrich, forced him to stand, turned him around, and contorted his limbs. Aldrich complied, resembling a caged tiger subjected to the whip. His expression displayed a similar ferocity. Ironbeard perceived Aldrich's countenance, blinked uncertainly, and assessed him for a considerable period. Eventually he withdrew his money pouch, which he passed to the trader to weigh. While the watcher performed this task, he commanded one of his servants to remove the boy's shackles. The trader stopped in his tracks, holding the scales, and interjected, "Allow me to advise that you retain them until you depart. I must inform you that he is quite challenging to control. You may lose both your funds and your servant." Ironbeard chuckled inwardly. "Oh, my dear friend, can you not decipher a person's demeanor better? Knowing what the Lord has scribed in one's eyes surpasses the ability to interpret runes." "Let us continue," he stated, instructing his servant to proceed. The chains clattered onto the ground within moments. Aldrich stared at Ironbeard, astonished. Subsequently, a realization overtook him, becoming aware that the aged man possessed a kind appearance, despite his sagacity and unattractiveness. As a result, the scowl disappeared from his face, comparable to an extra shackle's absence. "Thank you," Aldrich stated. Ironbeard tenderly placed his wrinkled and trembling hand on the boy's shoulder. "It is excellent that we comprehend each other. Come, you will lead Hedwig's horse initially, as she may encounter difficulty handling it with only one arm. Why has your face become so crimson?" he wondered. Aldrich reddened even more, but could not express to the elderly gentleman that he would rather trudge alongside an unbroken herd of Brahman cattle than walk a mile ahead of a stunning young Amazon who regarded him as a lowly canine. He muttered something incoherently and expeditiously followed the horses. Hedwig arose rigidly from her pile of animal skins. Every new movement revealed a new injury, but she gritted her teeth and raised her chin defiantly. After bidding farewell to the merchant, she walked without a limp and mounted her horse with ease. The sunlight reflected off her silver helmet and highlighted her flowing hair, transforming it into a shining aura that concealed the tattered fabric and stains, even hiding the incomplete kirtle that stopped at her knee. Aldrich assisted the elderly man onto his horse, reluctantly admiring Hedwig's prowess. Perhaps someday she would see that he was not as despicable as he. She made a commanding gesture, and he reluctantly complied. He took his position at her horse's reins, and the trio began their journey. Chapter 3. A Gallant Outlaw. For a time, the trail of the small group ran along the churning Nid, whose banks were brimming with commotion and vitality. Here, a collection of swimming enthusiasts frolicked. There, a flotilla of fishing boats cast their nets. A supply vessel loaded provisions before joining up with one of the colossal military vessels. They cruised past King Olaf's shipyard, where innovative boats were being built, and one particularly striking cruiser rested on the rollers, soon to be launched. On the other bank lay the temporary housing of visiting Vikings, with their longboats docked in front. The path turned to the right, winding through tall enclosures that enclosed farm-like estates. All the houses had their finest features facing forward, like a line of soldiers in formation, while little more than their blackened roofs were visible through the trees. In a lot of the parks between the properties, cheerful and lavishly decorated booths filled the space. Most were vendors, but in one, over the heads of the delighted crowds, Aldrich glimpsed an acrobat and a cumbersome dancing bear, while in another a minstrel sang mournful love songs as people listened intently. The beguiling melodies of the harp wafted through the air and accompanied them far across the plain as the street veered even further to the right, penetrating a wood of aromatic evergreens and shimmering silver birches. Songbirds held a cacophonous carnival deep in the woods, while an occasional rabbit darted from one hiding place to another. A road from the south converged with theirs, moving toward the fjord. As they approached the crossroad, a cavalier galloped down it. He only caught a glimpse of them with a cursory glance. All Aldrich could see was that he was young and handsomely dressed. But Hedwig urgently exclaimed, "Magnus! Ironbeard, it was Magnus!" The elderly man hastily halted and stared at her, dazed. "Magnus? Where? What Magnus?" "Our Magnus, Tova's foster son. Oh, go after him! Shout!" she yelled, stretching her neck, but the wind was working against her. "It's impossible that it could have been Jarl Harald's son," Ironbeard replied calmly. "He's away on a Viking voyage. Additionally, I am out of breath, and I'm not fit to ride that quickly. You've mistaken someone else for him. It's been 3 years since you've last seen him." "I will undertake the task myself," Hedwig declared, yanking the reins from Aldrich's grip, but Ironbeard restrained her by grabbing her arm. "You would undoubtedly be harmed. If you insist, the servant can go. He looks like a swift runner," Ironbeard advised. "But what message?" Aldrich inquired. Hedwig fidgeted on her mount. "Stop wasting time and go!" she exclaimed. In those times, people were believed to be quick runners. Legends say that there were individuals in both Ireland and the north so fleet-footed that no horse in existence could catch them. Within 10 minutes, Aldrich was beside the horseman, red, dripping wet, and full of rage. The newcomer was a dashing young nobleman with flowing golden locks and a sophisticated, fine face. His velvet cloak had ermine lining, his silk tunic was stitched with gold, his gloves embroidered with gold, his heels fitted with silver spurs, and he wore a golden chain about his neck. Aldrich glared at him, loathing him for his splendor, detesting him for his long, silky hair. The rider looked down in astonishment at the panting thrall with a shaved head. "What would you have me do?" he inquired. It was not an easy task to describe, but Aldrich stated it briefly. "If you are Magnus Sverrir, a young woman named Hedwig requests that you turn back." "I am Magnus Sverrir," answered the youth with a nod, "but I am unfamiliar with any Norwegian maidens called Hedwig." Aldrich pondered whether Hedwig might belong to the gang from Greenland, but he didn't say anything. "What is her full name?" the young nobleman inquired. "If there is more, I am unaware," Aldrich replied. "Where does she reside?" asked Magnus. "Who knows?" responded Aldrich in irritation. "Are you her father's slave?" the lord asked. "Unfortunately, I am the hostage of certain Norse bandits," Aldrich answered. Young Sverrir's eyebrows slanted into a frown. Aldrich met it with a black scowl. Suddenly, while they stood glaring at each other, an arrow flew out from the thicket a little ways down the path, whizzing between them. A second arrow barely missed Aldrich's head. A third took a lock of Magnus's blonde hair. Immediately after, a man burst out of the brush and approached them at a gallop, tossing aside a bow and drawing a sword. Forgetting there was no sword there any more, Aldrich instinctively reached for it, but young Sverrir stopped him authoritatively. "Step back. They were aimed at me. This is my quarrel." He hurled himself from the saddle, unsheathing his sword in a flash of light. The two of them didn't need to say anything to one another. As soon as they came face to face, their swords clashed in an exchange of lightning-fast blows. Aldrich put a calming hand around the startled horse's neck, settling in to watch. It wasn't long before any thoughts of quarrelling with Magnus Sverrir vanished from Aldrich's mind. He'd never seen anyone handle a weapon with as much grace and ease as the young nobleman. Admiration filled his heart. "I hope he wins," he muttered under his breath. "By St. George, I hope he wins." With the excitement building, his soothing strokes on the horse's neck transformed into frenzied slaps. The archer was a formidable fighter, putting up a strong defense. Back and forth they went, shifting and changing tactics until Magnus began using his weapon in ways that even caught his opponent off guard. Never losing his swiftness, he faked a left-handed attack, and before the archer could react, darted the tip of his sword like a striking snake, piercing his opponent's shoulder. Snarling, the archer fell to the ground with Magnus's sword at his throat and his foot on his chest. "You understand now that you won't be taking my scalp," Magnus said sternly. "You made sure I was banished, shot 3 arrows at me, and for what? Because I outshot you in last year's contest. If I ever got my hands on you, I threatened to bury a blade in your gut." He kicked him contemptuously before stepping back. "You're a sneaky low-life scavenger," he continued. "I'm ashamed I can't find it in my heart to slit your throat now that I have you at my mercy. But I've never been one to stoop to those levels, and you're not worth it. Crawl away, you worthless cur." As the archer stumbled away, clutching his wounded shoulder, Magnus calmly returned to his horse, wiping his sword clean. "You were kind to stay and hold, Highflyer," he remarked, mounting up. "If he had been frightened off, I would have been delayed on my lengthy journey." That refocused their discussion to the original purpose of their meeting, but Aldrich now spoke with flawless politeness. "I beg of you to rethink your course and come back with me. While I may not have all the answers to your questions, I can assure you that the maiden you seek is waiting for you at the crossroads with Ironbeard, whom she calls her foster-father." "Ironbeard!" exclaimed Magnus Sverrir. "Tova's foster-father had that same name. Could it be my little foster-sister from Greenland?" "I've heard mention of Greenland and Tove," Aldrich assured him. The young man slapped his knee in wonder. "What perfect timing! I was just inquiring after Tove at the King's guard-room, but was told he was away on the King's business. I was going to leave the city when I met you. Take hold of the strap on my saddle, and let's hurry." Magnus spurred Highflyer ahead with Aldrich at his side, struggling to keep up and catch his breath so he could ask his many questions. But soon enough, they reached the crossroads and their waiting escorts. Ironbeard gave a sigh of relief, and Hedwig cried out in pleasure and surprise at seeing Magnus. The Northman greeted her with genuine affection and embraced Ironbeard warmly. "I cannot express how happy I am to see you all. And Hedwig, in that outfit, you could easily pass for the legendary Brynhild we used to tell stories about." Hedwig's fair face blushed, and Aldrich smiled inwardly at the thought of the young Viking being boxed on the ear by the young Amazon. However, Hedwig was only ungentle toward those she deemed beneath her friendliness. She gestured for Aldrich to hand her the rein she'd dropped, while responding to Magnus in a good-natured manner. "Nay now, my comrade, you won't be mean enough to scold me for my short kirtle, when it was you who taught me to do things that make a short kirtle necessary. Have you already forgotten how you used to steal me away from my embroidery to go hunting with you?" Magnus laughed. "By no means, nor how Haraldson scolded us when we returned. I'd give a ring to know what she would say if she were here now. I believe that you'd get a slap for all your warlike array." Hedwig's spur made her horse prance and rear defiantly. "Haraldson isn't here, nor do I ever expect her to rule over me again. She struck me once too often, and I ran away to Tove. I've been living almost like the shield maidens we were accustomed to talking about for 2 years now. Oh, Magnus, I've been so happy, so free and so happy." She threw her head back and lifted her beautiful face up to the sunlit sky and the fresh wind. A sudden feeling of sympathy thrilled Aldrich. He realized that it wasn't boldness that made Hedwig what she was, but the Norse blood crying out for adventure, open air, and freedom. It didn't seem strange to him as he thought of it. All of a sudden he realized how unusual it was that all maidens didn't feel the same, and that there were some who remained prisoners, fettered in trailing gowns while spinning. Ironbeard nodded in agreement with Magnus's amazed look. "The child speaks the truth. Over the winters she stays at the king's house with one of the queen's women, who is Tove's friend, and during the summers she voyages with me. But it seems we've talked enough about her. Tell us, how did you come to Norway, and woe, steady, woe. Pray accompany us to the encampment, Hedwig interjected, with Ironbeard preoccupied by his restless steed. Halla Vidarson and Einar Oscarsson, familiar faces from our days in Greenland, are in attendance, as well as the entire crew of the Sea Deer. The Sea Deer! Exclaimed Magnus. Surely Tove has relinquished his vessel now that he is serving King Olaf's guard. Ironbeard's horse continued its fidgeting, forcing him to leave the response to Hedwig. He has not abandoned his ship. When he is not aiding King Olaf in battle, Ironbeard navigates the Sea Deer on trading expeditions, and the ship is kept in the king's shipyard throughout the winter. There are 40 crewmates, including myself. No need for your skepticism. I am able to command the helm as proficiently as any other sailor. Am I not, Ironbeard? Ironbeard assented with a nod, allowing his horse to seize the opportunity to sprint homeward, despite the rider's attempts to control its motion. This caused the entire entourage to start up again. Do journey onward with me to the encampment, dear friend Magnus, Hedwig pressed. It is just a short distance across the riverbank, even if only for a brief period of time. Magnus cupped the reins with a smile and a sigh combined. I will grant that request. It seems you are unaware of the calamity that has recently transpired. The lawman has banished me from the district. Aldrich was elated to hear that he would have more time to socialize with the young Norseman. Hedwig was astounded, pausing on her horse to stare at him. It must be in jest, she eventually voiced. You, the most agreeable individual, cannot have broken the law. Magnus chuckled ruefully. Presently I am not considered amicable in our district. Nevertheless, there is no reason to take it to heart, my foster sister. I have not committed anything that is disgraceful. Would I dare to confront Tove with such an action? Eventually this shall pass. Hedwig leaned from her saddle to shake the thrall's hand and bid him welcome. You have come to the right place, she said cheerfully, for nowhere in the world could you be more welcome. Only wait and see how Halla and Einar will receive you. She dismissed the thrall with a shake of her head, and they rode off. The camp was not far away, and once they crossed the river, they turned left and wound along the woody banks towards the fjord. Entering a thicket of hazel bushes, they were met by faint sounds of shouting and laughter. They emerged into a green little valley and beheld the camp. Aldrich was struck by 6 wooden booths tented over with striped linen and adorned with flags, a leaping fire, a pile of slain deer, a string of grazing horses, and a throng of brawny men tending to various tasks. "There it is!" cried Hedwig. "Saw you ever a prettier spot? Tonight we go to a feast at the king's house. That is why he is so busy." As they neared the camp, Hedwig pointed out Ironbeard under an ash tree, Einar Oscarsson bending over a shield, and Halla wrestling in a nearby area. "That is the strongest man in Greenland," she said of Halla. "Even Valgar cannot stand against him." They approached the camp with high, sweet notes rising above the clatter. Every man dropped what he was doing and leapt up with shouts of greeting and welcome. Magnus disappeared behind a hedge of yellow heads and waving hands. Aldrich was grabbed by an old German man who said, "Stormwind, but I have waited a long time for you. That beast was like the insides of me to have outshaken. Bring to me a horn of ale, but first give me your shoulder to yonder booth." Chapter 4. In a Viking Lair. Leave your weapons in the field. Do not be a foolish man. You never know when you may need your sword in hand. Havamal. The encampment glowed red in the fading light of day, and a hush fell over the land, broken only by the occasional bird call and the soft murmur of the nearby river. Magnus reclined beneath a tree, his gaze fixed upon the rustling leaves above. Hedwig emerged from her makeshift dwelling dressed in blue silk, with a golden diadem atop her head. The high-born maiden looked a far cry from the farm girl she once was. Magnus regarded her critically. "I'm not convinced that this attire is fit for a feast," he remarked. "Where are your bracelets and gold trinkets befitting a woman of your rank? It does not speak favorably of Tove if this is the best he can provide." "That is an unfair assumption," retorted Hedwig. "Tove is willing to buy me whatever I desire, but it is I who prefer simpler garments. Surely you have not forgotten my disdain for ostentation. But I suppose this is to be expected," she added, visibly annoyed. "After all, the Jarl's son has dwelt in Normandy. A Greenlandic farm girl is bound to appear plain in his eyes." As she turned to leave, Magnus sprang to his feet, grabbing her by the shoulders and giving her a friendly shake. "Now you are beginning to sound like your bondmaid. Do you not know that all the gold in Normandy cannot compare to the beauty of a single strand of your hair?" Hedwig could not help but smile at his words. "Ah, now I understand why they call you Magnus Silvertongue," she laughed.
Suddenly her tone grew serious. "Magnus, I do not care how you chide me for my lack of finery, but tell me, do you not despise me for being so unlike other maidens?" Magnus released her hands and took them gently in his own. "Despise you, Hedwig, my sister? How could I, when you are the bravest ally and the most loyal friend I have ever known?" With a flush of satisfaction she exclaimed, "If that is truly how you feel, I am content." She took a step towards her horse, then looked back sadly. "It seems inhospitable to leave you alone like this. Would you like to join us after all?"
Magnus emphatically refused with a gesture as he threw himself back down. "I'd rather be left alone than be buried with my head cut off, which would happen if I visited the king without an invitation." Hedwig eagerly insisted, "Don't let this stop you from finding joy. Tove is in good favour with King Olaf, and I have no doubt he can plead successfully on your behalf." Magnus, full of hope, murmured, "I certainly hope so. It's a great shame for me to be idle when all the brave men are fighting abroad or serving the king at home." With a heavy sigh he watched Hedwig walk away. As Hedwig passed by the largest of the sleeping houses, Aldrich emerged from the door. He had spent the afternoon cleaning helmets while hearing complaints from the crew. He wondered what kind of a mistress Hedwig was to the young Bond girl who ran after her with the forgotten cloak, and also why the girl's brown braids reminded him of his mother's Saxon waiting-maid, Edvarda. Suddenly the sound of a deep-drawn breath made Aldrich turn to face a young mail-clad Viking. He recognized the shaggy black locks of Einar Oscarsson, whom Hedwig had pointed out earlier that day. Yet it was not the surprise of seeing him that caused Aldrich to leap back into the shelter of the doorway. Rather, it was the expression on Einar's face, full of hate and menace, that made him feel like lifelong enemies meeting for the first time. Still gazing intently at him, Einar spoke slowly in a voice that quivered with emotion. "So you are the English slave, and already fixated on her? Skroppa seems to have spoken some truth." He abruptly stopped talking and glared while his hand moved towards his belt. For once Aldrich was completely thrown off. "Either this man has lost his mind," he muttered, crossing himself, "or he has mistaken me for someone else." He didn't get to finish speaking, though. Young Oscarsson's fingers closed around the handle of his knife, and he drew it out with a fierce cry, "But I'll make the rest of it a lie!" He flung himself onto Aldrich, throwing him backwards over the threshold. It's probable that that moment would have signaled the end for Aldrich if Valgar, the helmsman, wasn't in the booth getting ready for the feast. He was a colossal warrior, his face lined with scars and solid as the battle-axe by his side. He grabbed Einar's raised arm and took the blade from his hand. "I will not tolerate Tove's possession being damaged, Einar the Black," he said sternly. "Do you wish to strangle him? Release him, or I'll send you to the troll, body and bones." Einar got up reluctantly. Aldrich sprang up as if released from a constraint. "What has he done?" asked Valga, "that you should breach the law and assault another man's slave?" Instead of erupting into the rage Aldrich expected, Einar turned red and looked away. "I'm not pleased with his appearance, that's enough," he mumbled. Valga scoffed and threw him his knife. "Go and gain some intelligence. Is he yours that you should kill him because you don't like his nose? Dress up. And you," he added, nodding at Aldrich behind him, "you should remove yourself from his sight. Tempting a hungry dog with meat that you need to keep is unwise." "If I could only get my hands on a hunting knife," Aldrich yelled furiously, "I swear on all the saints of England I wouldn't move." Valgar didn't waste any time arguing. He grabbed Aldrich and ejected him from the door with so much energy that he rolled down the slope. The impact of the blow inclined Aldrich to remain still, where he sat for a while. Gradually the cool and calm atmosphere around him eased his temper. It was clear that Einar Oscarsson had gone insane. Undoubtedly it was the best decision to follow Valgar's advice and stay away from him, or at least until he could acquire a weapon to defend himself. Aldrich laid himself down comfortably on the soft and dewy grass. He waited patiently until the revellers, adorned in shining armour and colourful cloaks, clanked upon their horses and rode away into the shadows of the wood path. When the last of them shouted their farewell to Magnus and disappeared, Aldrich stood up and walked slowly back to the abandoned camp. Even the sunset light left the area. A soft greyness engulfed it, away from the world. The night was filled with noises, and a cool breeze whispered softly in the pines. Softly and sweetly, a voice rose from amongst the booths, singing a plaintive English ballad. Aldrich recognized the song with a pang of both pleasure and pain. In the old days, Edvarda had sung that song. Poor little Edvarda, with her gentle-hearted nature. The last time he had seen her, she had been carried past him, unconscious and white, by one of the marauding Danes.
He shook himself fiercely to shake off the memory. Turning the corner of Hedwig's booth, he stumbled upon the singer, a slender figure dressed in white, leaning in the doorway's shadow. Magnus still lounged under the trees, half dozing, half listening. As the thrall stepped out of the shadow into the moonlight, the singer sprang to her feet, and her song blended into a great cry. "My lord Aldrich!" It was Edvarda herself. Running to him, she dropped on her knees and began to kiss his hands and weep over them. "Oh, my dear lord," she sobbed, "you are so different. And your hair, it is so different too. Oh, it is a good thing Earl Edmund and your lady mother are dead, as it would break their hearts, as it does mine." Forgetting her own misfortunes, she wept bitterly over his, though he tried with every gentle word to soothe her. It was a melancholic encounter, one that imbued bitterness within both parties. The harrowing separation they had endured, the binding circumstances that governed their connection, and the despairing, inescapable future that lay ahead all contributed to the grim atmosphere of the meeting. When Edvarda finally arrived, her petite throat was afflicted with pangs of grief. Aldrich collapsed onto the trunk of a tree and buried his face in his hands. It was there that his hardships forcibly extracted the first groan from his unyielding lips. Magnus had gone unnoticed in their preoccupation. Neither of them recognized the young Viking's inquisitive gaze. However, Aldrich jolted with surprise when a hand rested gently upon his shoulder. "It seems to me," Magnus spoke up, "that a man should be joyous when he has just discovered a friend." Aldrich glanced at him, his eyes full of savage hopelessness. "Joyous? Would you be light-hearted if you had discovered Hedwig, a mere servant in an English encampment?" He shook off Magnus's hand with a violent gesture. Nonetheless, Magnus swiftly replied, "No, I would appear even darker than you, if it's even possible." That mollified the thrall somewhat. The young Viking sat down beside him, and they both stared vacantly toward the river, which shimmered like liquid silver under the moonlight. Eventually, Magnus spoke, dreamily. "While you two were engaged in conversation, it crossed my mind how unjustly fate distributes things. According to what the maiden conveyed, you are the offspring of an English jarl who has engaged in numerous conflicts with the Norse. I, however, am the son of a Norwegian jarl who has faced the English in battle on multiple occasions. If roles were reversed, it would be just as plausible for me to be the captive and you the victor." "That's true," Aldrich replied slowly. He said no more, but the idea placated and softened him in an unusual way. The young men did not look at each other, but, oddly enough, a kind of amicability seeped from their silence. After a while, still facing the river, Magnus said, "It appears to me that the honorable thing for me to do in this situation is to extend to you the same friendship I would want if our positions were reversed." Aldrich's sight was momentarily obstructed by something that blurred the bright river. "I offer you my thanks," he spoke with a husky voice. "Outside of Edvarda, I am friendless." After a brief pause, he proceeded to recount a story he had never intended on telling anyone from the north. "The Danes burned down my father's castle. He and many of my relatives were killed. The robbers came at night, and a Danish peasant opened the gates for them, even though he had been in my father's employ for 4 years. It was from him that I learned to speak the northern tongue. They took me while I was asleep, tied me up, and brought me onto their ships. They also took the young maidens who served my mother, Edvarda included, and many young people who lived in the castle. They took everything they found valuable. Afterward they placed great bundles of hay in the hall, set them alight, and—" "The cruel wretches!" outburst Magnus. "Did they not ask your mother to leave in safety? No, they despised her the most." Aldrich's head lifted higher. "My mother was a princess of the Alaric's bloodline." By chance, Magnus had heard of the great king. A sparkle lit up his face. "Alaric, the one who defeated the Danes? It's no surprise they hated his kin after realizing how sly he was. I know a fantastic song about him. When they were hunting him down to kill him, he had the audacity to enter the Danish camp alone. They assumed he was just a simple-minded musician. However, he learned all their secrets. That's an admirable blood to have. If I were English, I would prefer to be related to him rather than Ethelred." He looked directly at Aldrich with fiery eyes. The two of them were standing face to face. Suddenly he stretched out his hand. "It's only bad luck that you're Tov's slave. It could have easily been me. I'll make a deal with you. I'll remember this and never use your servitude against you." Few of the proud Viking race were generous enough to make such a concession. Aldrich found himself visibly affected by the offering. He clasped the outstretched hand with a firm grasp. "Will you do that?" he asked. The response seemed delayed, as if finding the right words required more than a brief moment. Eventually words were spoken. "If you grant that to me, I assure on my part that I will pardon your northern blood and your dominance over me, and accept you as my own brother." Chapter 5. The Ire of a Shield Maiden. Never treat a guest with insult or derision. They often little know who sits within. This was a lesson Aldrich learned, grinding meal on a small stone hand mill outside the provision shed when Edvarda sought him. "If it pleases you, my lord," she began. He let out a bitter laugh. "By St. George, that fits me well. If it pleases you, and my lord, to a short-haired, callous-handed hound of a slave." Her eyes filled with tears, but her gentle mouth remained obstinate. "Have they drawn Earl Edmund's blood out of you? Until they have done that, you will be my lord. Your lady mother in heaven would curse me for a traitor if I denied your nobility." Aldrich sighed resignedly, finishing the last handful of meal. "Go on, then, if you must. We spoke enough of the matter last night. Only see to it that no one hears you. I warn you that I shall kill the first who laughs, and who could help laughing?" She knew better than to respond. Instead, she motioned over her shoulder toward the group of late-risen revellers who were lounging under the trees, breaking their fast with an early meal. "Ironbeard bids you come and serve the food." "If it pleases me," Aldrich echoed sarcastically. "My dear lord, I pray you give over all bitterness. I pray you be prudent toward them. I have not been a shield maiden's thrall for nearly a year without learning something." "Poor little dove in a hawk's nest. Certainly I think you have learned to weep. You need not pity me thus, Lord Aldrich. It is likely that my mistress even loves me in her own way. She has given me more ornaments than she keeps for herself. She would slay anyone who spoke harshly to me. What is it if now and then she herself strikes me? I have had many a blow from your mother's nurse. I do not find that I am much worse than before. No, no. My trouble is all for you. My dearest lord, I implore you not to waken their anger. They have tempers so quick, and hands even quicker." Remembering his encounter with Einar the evening before, Aldrich's eyes flared up hotly, but he would make no promises as he arose to answer the summons. The little maid carried a troubled heart as she worked on repairing Hedwig's torn skirt. No one noticed the young thrall as he refilled their cups. The older men were half asleep on the grass, having indulged too much in mead. Meanwhile, the 4 young people sat together under birch trees, their wolfhounds begging for food. Magnus, sipping his ale, remarked on Tov's absence from the feast. "He won't return for 2 days," Hedwig replied after swallowing a mouthful of smoked meat. "He's gone south with guardsmen to convert a chief to Christianity." Magnus was astonished. Is Tov himself a Christian? Halla the wrestler advised Magnus to forget the notion of a curse that some attributed to Tov's lineage. Einar, here, came near being impaled on Tov's sword for merely mentioning Skroppa's name. Aldrich was jolted by the name. Einar glared at Magnus, who had taken on a curious expression. "You chatter more than Odin's ravens with your news," growled the Black One. "During meals I would rather use my jaws for eating than babbling. Slave, bring me more fish." Aldrich waited for the opportune moment to acquire a sharp bronze knife lying on the plates before approaching cautiously, as he added more herrings onto the thin bread that doubled as a plate. Einar, meanwhile, showed no interest in him, nor the flies swarming near his food. The cause of their animosity, evidently, was under wraps. As Aldrich was preparing to depart from the group, Halla suddenly approached him. The wrestler gestured over to 2 large horizontal stones he had arranged while seated. "This bread is quite difficult to chew," he complained. The stones didn't look anything like bread, which made Aldrich believe that it was a ridiculous jest. He retorted, "Do you think I'm dumb enough not to know bread from stones?" Halla didn't seem to find his statement amusing and replied, "Stones? I don't comprehend. Are these some type of stones I can treat like this?" He then rose his first, which was the size of a sledgehammer, and crashed down on the upper piece, rendering it shattered. At that point, Aldrich realized that the display was aimed at him, but he concealed his reaction and turned away. Hedwig, however, obstructed his path. "You need to bring me something I want first. In the northeast section of the provision shed, am I right, Magnus?" she queried. Young Sverrir struggled to reclaim his herring from one of the hounds, although to no avail. He affirmed over his shoulder. Hedwig then looked thrilled and licked her lips. "Honey," she disclosed to the others. "Magnus located a jar of honey last night. That swine Olver tucked it away on the highest shelf. Most probably the goldsmith's kid gave it to him, and he planned to keep everything to himself." "Perform a trick on him, swiftly," commanded Lord Aldrich to his thrall. Be careful not to arouse suspicion from the one with the bandaged head. Hide the jar with your arm should he look sharply at you, making it seem like you are taking a bit of food for yourself. He will be too drowsy to give it further thought." The figures around Lord Aldrich dissipated as he stared at the imposing young woman before him. She beckoned him away, but he remained rooted to the spot. "Let him suspect me of theft!" he exclaimed incredulously. The grass rustled beneath Hedwig's foot as she spoke with impatience. "I assure you he won't care, and if he threatens to flog you, I will intervene. Don't be a coward. What are you afraid of?" The heat of Aldrich's anger stirred up a powerful blaze behind his eyes. Through gritted teeth he responded, "I will not allow him to believe that I would steal even a single dried herring if I were starving." Hedwig's eyes flickered with flames of their own, while Einar and the wrestler sprang up with annoyance. Despite their words, Hedwig's actions spoke louder. She rose to full height, grabbed the riding whip from the ground, and lashed it across the thrall's cheek with such force that it lit up in a livid red. "You're making a commotion," Halla chided in a placating tone. Einar laughed cruelly, settling himself up against the trunk of a tree to see the outcome. As Hedwig raised her whip for a second time, the thrall pounced on her, wrenching the whip from her grip and shattering it into pieces. He wished he could have done the same to Hedwig too, possessed by the animalistic urge to kill upon seeing the laughing Einar. Without a sound he spun around and leapt upon the Black One, pressing him against the tree, suffocating him with his bare hands. Chapter 6. The Song of Smiting Steel. A man should be a friend, to him and to his friend, but no man should be the friend of his foe's friend. These were the wise words of Havamal, and yet, in the madness of his rush, Aldrich ignored them. He sprung upon Einar from the left, leaving his enemy's right arm free. Immediately this arm began forcing and jamming its way downward across Einar's body. Aldrich saw what was coming and struggled desperately, but he could not prevent it. In an instant, the Black One's fingers had closed around his sword hilt, and the blade hissed into the air. Only a moment's wrenching away and a lightning leap aside saved the thrall from being run through. Aldrich gave himself up for lost, and stiffened himself to die bravely. As Einar advanced with a jeering laugh, Hedwig caught his sleeve, and Halla laid an iron hand upon his shoulder. "Think what you do," the wrestler admonished. "This will make the third of Tov's thralls that you have slain, and you have no blood money to pay him." "Shame on you, Einar Oscarsson!" cried Hedwig. "Would you stain your honourable sword with a thing so foul as thrall blood?" Halla's grip brought Einar to a standstill, and the contempt in Hedwig's words was reflected in his face. He sheathed his sword with a scornful gesture. "You speak truth. I do not know how it was that I thought to do a thing so unworthy of me. I will leave Valga to draw the fellow's blood with a stirrup leather." He turned away, and the others followed. Those of the crew who had raised their muddled heads to see what the trouble was laid them down again with grunts of disappointment. Aldrich was left alone, untouched. Yet truly his anguish would not have been greater had they cut him in pieces. Without knowing what he did, he sprang after them, crying hoarsely, "Cowards! Churls! What know you of my blood? Give me a weapon and prove me, or cast yours aside man to man." His voice broke with his passion and the violence of his heartbeat. But the raucous laughter that erupted was suddenly silenced. In that moment, Magnus had abandoned his pursuit of the thieving dog and rejoined the group just in time to overhear their conversation. The instant Aldrich finished speaking, Magnus positioned himself next to the young thrall with an air of authority, reminding everyone that he was the son of the famous Jarl Harald, the highest born in the camp. In a stern tone he addressed the group. "Your ignorance on this matter is foolish. Can you not see that he is no less of noble birth than any of us? Do you truly believe that a Jarl's son can be transformed into a dog by mere misfortune? He will be given a chance to demonstrate his skill. I myself will challenge him at any length he chooses. What I have deemed worthy is not to be scorned by anyone else." He unbuckled his own gold-adorned weapon and pressed it into Aldrich's hands, before turning to the wrestler with demands. "Halla, if you consider yourself my ally, I ask for the use of your sword." Without a word, Halla surrendered his sword to Magnus. The two young men, one a noble and the other a thrall, stood facing each other with swords drawn. But before their blades clashed, Einar stepped between them, using his own blade to deflect theirs. "Enough," he growled. "What Magnus Sverrir does, I will not object to. I will face you honourably, thrall. However, you need not beg for mercy." A vicious expression crossed his face, betraying his inexplicable loathing for Aldrich. Undaunted, Aldrich met Einar's hatred with defiance. "This steel shall shatter before I ever plead for mercy," he shouted, before lunging at his enemy. The clash of steel echoed through the valley. The spectators stepped back, allowing the two young men space. The lazy onlookers sat up to take notice. It was an even match, with Aldrich making up for any lack of strength with his dexterity and skill. Sparks flew as their swords clashed again and again, the sound like the hiss of serpents. The colour drained from Hedwig's face as she watched with bated breath. Magnus's eyes, like two glowing lamps, focused on the two combatants, moving to and fro with a vengeful fury. The valley was silent except for the clash and clatter of their swords. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Einar let out a panting gasp of triumph as his blade bit into flesh, staining the white tunic of Aldrich with a circle of red. Aldrich's blows became more furious, as if pain and despair gave him added strength. With a mighty force, Aldrich shattered Einar's blade, leaving him defenseless. A murmur rose from the watching crowd, but Halla reminded them of the importance of fair play. Tossing away his broken blade, Einar waited in scornful silence, while Aldrich was left empty-handed. "I do no murder," Aldrich panted. "Man to man, we will finish it." They moved around the circle with lowered heads and watchful eyes, crouching like beasts ready to spring. Then, like two angry bears, they grappled, each attempting to throw his adversary. Only the blood on their faces and bulging veins in their muscular arms showed the strain and struggle, with both men evenly matched and braced, motionless. Their heels ground deep into the soft sod as their laboured breaths became more pronounced. This couldn't last much longer. Aldrich's forehead dripped with sweat. Suddenly, Einar grasped Aldrich's wounded shoulder in a vice-like grip. The pain surged through Aldrich, stiffening his muscles like iron. Einar swayed and staggered, then fell headlong, laughing scornfully. Mad with pain, Aldrich knelt on Einar's chest. "If I had a sword," he gasped. "If only I had a sword!" Shaken but still laughing, Einar retorted, "What prevents you from getting your sword? I will not flee. Do you think it matters to me how soon I die?" Aldrich writhed in agony. He quickly snatched his bronze knife from his belt and pressed it against Einar's throat. The group remained motionless as Einar gazed back at Aldrich without flinching. It was the group's poise that brought Aldrich to his senses, reminding him that taking a human life meant transforming a warm, living body into a cold, lifeless mass of clay. The anger drained from his heart, and he stood up. "Magnus Sverrir," he said, "I present you with your friend's life in appreciation for all you have done for me." Magnus's handsome face brightened. "However," Aldrich continued, "I feel it's only right for him to clarify why he has such hostility towards me, and—" Einar sprang up, his indifference turning into rage. "I will never explain myself, even if you remove my tongue," he bellowed. Even his comrades were shocked at his outburst. To undermine Einar, Aldrich sneered. "I'm convinced you're too afraid to speak of Skropa." "Skropa!" the group repeated in unison. Only two red spots on Einar's cheeks betrayed his awareness of their comments. He gave Aldrich a long, intimidating glare. "You should know by now that I fear nothing," Einar replied. Hedwig foolishly interjected, "I think it's honourable, Einar, that you tell him why you're his enemy." Unconsciously she disregarded Einar's status as a thrall and treated him as an equal. Both Einar and Aldrich noticed. It sparked an uncontainable rage in Einar. "If you speak up for him," he roared, grasping her wrist, "I will wield my blade against you." Even before she freed herself and Halla and Magnus confronted him, Einar realized he had gone too far. He left the group abruptly, standing a few feet away with his back toward them, descending into self-loathing. For a long time, none of them spoke. Magnus questioned with his eyes, and Halla answered with a shrug. Hedwig attempted to approach Einar, but Magnus gestured to her not to. They waited in dead silence, listening to distant voices of the other men, insects chirping, and birds singing on the trees above them.